Tuesday, March 19th, we have a reorganization of the rec board this evening. I want to bring to your attention that we've had 2 settlement agreements over the last 30 years with the rec association. You're familiar with the one last year with Catania. That was signed July 5th, 2023, and we'll get to that in a moment. 6 days later, a board meeting was called, probably to inform everyone and announce pretty much what was going on and some of the details of the settlement agreement. And that's reflected in the minutes of the meeting held on July 11th of last year. If we take a look and scroll down to the President's report, President at the time reiterated that rec belongs to all 4 towers, indicated that anyone occupying an officer position in their respective tower board, they will not be eligible to occupy the identical position on the rec board simultaneously. It was also indicated that the rec board officers will consist of 1 member from each of the 4 towers to achieve equity and representation. So for example, you had a treasurer and a secretary both coming out of Catania, no can do. It needs to be from separate towers. At least according to the report, at least according to the spirit of what the president at the time was communicating. Now let's take a closer look at that settlement agreement. Oh, and not this Board of Cashare part. I think we've been there already. Remember, this doesn't even exist anymore, this paragraph M, where originally the 3 designs for the Board of Cashare was going to be a vote taken by all of us, and that got gutted. The day after Christmas, it got gutted. It was signed December 26th. And still, there are no answers to any of that. Why it was gutted, why there was just a rapid 180 turnaround. Rec board folks speaking privately in November and December, that rug pulled all of us on this, which still no one has answered to, right? Do you remember October 25th? All they wanted to do was make an addendum to extend the time only. But by December 17th, they voted for an addendum with all sorts of changes, which we got into a prior video. I'm not here to reiterate all of that. Still though, this board needs to be held accountable and answer exactly to us what had happened to gut this and take away the decision making from any of us. Scrolling down here, here's the important part. Getting to the, not the spirit of the settlement agreement, but the letter of the settlement agreement. So let's look at this paragraph Q. Quad rec officers. The quad rec shall consist of 2 board members from each tower, as per the current bylaws. An officer may not hold the same officer position in the Quatermain Recreation Board as on their board. That was just discussed in the meeting minutes 6 days later. But it continues, and look at how this thing was written. There's a big condition to that. Unless no one on the Quatermain Rec Board assumes the position. And then it also says each of the 4 towers shall hold 1 officer position. We already discussed that with the example of treasurer and secretary. And that's a shall. That's a must. That's a no if, ands, or about. That is a definitive statement, the second sentence. There's no wiggle room for that. The 4 officers, they have to be 1 from each tower, period. End of subject. But if you look at the first sentence here of the officer not holding the same position as on their board, there's a qualifier. Unless no one on the quad rec board assumes the position. So that means in the case of last resort, there could be a president of one association and theoretically a president of rec, which defeats the purpose of the intent of all this. And how did this shabby language happen? Well, there was a problem in the last board. They governed by emergency. Everything was an emergency. Whether it was tiles or a restaurant, everything was emergent. Nothing around here is an emergency unless there's issues of structural integrity, issues of life and limb, fire, flood, blood. Those are the only emergencies. Just about every decision made last year was not an emergency. Biometrics, not an emergency. None of it was. The pressure from the board that doesn't know how to govern well, or in the last board, in some cases, literally ruling, well, that all rolls downhill, down to the lawyers. The lawyers are under the gun to draft things quickly, and now they're drafting by emergency, and we get shitty contracts. We have to go back and amend them, and it costs more problems and more time. Drafting by emergency that had extra language in the restaurant agreement that should have never have been there in the first place. Things like that. So here we are. We're faced with the same problem right here. If we were to honor what this thing says, unless no one from a rec board assumes a position, that means in tonight's reorg meeting, one should be nominating every other person first to see if they want an officer position that is not an officer in their board. And then and only then, if no one accepted the nomination, would then one theoretically be able to hold the same office across the 2 associations. That's not the spirit of what we wanted. You could get away with it to the letter of the law. You could still get away with being the president of a tower and president of rec, assuming no one else wanted the position. So I ask you, if if that ever were to occur here, and hopefully that doesn't occur here tonight, or if in the event it did occur here tonight, it is in the best interest of anyone that the officer accepting a position on rec must immediately, publicly, in the moment, resign from that office, from their tower, and then the tower works out to fill the vacancy. So let's say you have a president position. They must resign from the president of tower. The VP of that tower is holding the fort till their next meeting to then reorg and shuffle the deck to assure we never run into this problem. But this is another example of bad drafting, another example of a little loophole that could be exploited, another example of how someone could play games and cling to the letter of the law. We're so good at that when it's convenient. Hopefully there's none of that. Moving on quickly to the earlier settlement agreement, which was in 1995, and this matters a little bit. It is known as the Markowitz settlement agreement. A lot of the dispute can be found here, where utilities were being paid by Tower for years inadvertently. Utilities like for the water or AC for the social hall, electricity and the motors and the pumps for the social hall, electricity, the men's gym, that was all being paid for by the tower. And part of the settlement was for Catania and Britannia to make good for a certain bit of back pay, a 5-year period, to make them whole, a reimbursement. You can see that a little in the earlier paragraph here. 90 to 95 will be reimbursed for that. So that was part of the settlement. But the very last piece of this settlement is relevant in why I'm bringing it up. And you can see that right here in this subparagraph K. All parties agree that in the event of a stalemate or deadlock vote of the 8 members of the rec board, a 9th member shall be retained through the American Arbitration Association for the express purpose of breaking the deadlock on the particular issue only. The quad rec board will function with 8 members in all other circumstances. This is an amendment to our operating agreement. It's not going anywhere. This is how we operate by law. So let's take a hypothetical tonight. Let's say there's a stalemate tonight on deciding who the president of rec is. The only way that got resolved, if the stalemate persisted, is to go to get a person from the American Arbitration Association to decide for us who's president. Our original docs used to have a different deciding mechanism, which was apparently gutted. I don't know whether there was more concentration of power for the rec board, or back in the day there was more of a fairness that things could work out with an even number board. I remember in the year 2010, we were stalemating for like a half a year, to the point we couldn't even hold a rec board meeting. It was that contentious back in the day. Obviously, recent tensions in recent years wasn't so much a stalemate situation, but it led to the imbalances we have, which were then reflected in the settlement agreement last year. So that's the recap. We should be aware of a few things going into tonight's reorg meeting. There are vulnerabilities in the letter of the law of the settlement agreement in the best interest of everyone. In the event that there's a stalemate, I've just given you the sense of how we get past the stalemate, and if for even a split second someone is holding office, the same office across 2 associations, they better resign from one of them immediately, publicly. And lastly, that was a hard shall with that there shall be no exceptions. Different officer, one from each tower. The 4 officers, president, VP, treasurer, and secretary, they must all come from a different tower. And you might say that's too restrictive, and maybe the language, let me go back to that language. Maybe the language should have been in reversed here. The condition, if anything, should have maybe been placed on the last one, because that's so much more restrictive. That's a tall order to always have a different officer from a different tower. That's the way I look at it. Maybe that was the intention. Well, it didn't come out that way. Here we are again with shabby contracts. Okay, what else is new? All right, hey everyone, have a good day. It'll be interesting to see what happens tonight at the rec meeting and the reorganization.